Right, good morning. If we could all please settle down. Thank you. Right, thank you very much. Okay, so today, of course, is the later on will be the official opening of our incredible conference that we've had for the last 3 days by His Excellency the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe, Dr. Idi Mnangagwa. So we must be on time. I emphasize that because I gave myself latitude over the last 3 days to allow question and answers, and that did eat into the time. Now, just a quick recap, of course. We've had an incredible conference. And of course, we'd really like to thank the Ministry Finance and Economic Development for putting together such an incredible Zimbabwe Economic Development Conference. Just to recap, we talked about monetary and exchange rate policy. We've also looked at fiscal policy reforms in Zimbabwe. We looked at industrialization and trade policy, and also the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement we touched on. Yesterday, public and private investments and the creation of enabling environments, not forgetting, of course, the role of capital markets in the development of Zimbabwe and development of an enabling environment for business. So we've covered quite a lot, and today we continue with the same theme, but this morning we're now looking at the informal sector development and poverty reduction, which of course is an interesting thing. I heard yesterday one of our panelists say, can anyone give me information about the informal sector? How many people are in the informal sector? Where are they? Well, it's quite an interesting thing. He wants empirical evidence. I think a lot of us know that evidence is on the ground. So it's interesting to see how we can formalize the informal sector. How can they be brought in to really boost development in Zimbabwe, as well as, of course, use that channel or use other channels to poverty reduce, which is very important for a developing nation like Zimbabwe's. So without further ado, we have to change the program a little bit around, but I'd like to call on Mr. A. Kavu from SIRDC, SIRDC TIPS. He's going to talk about informal sector development and poverty reduction, current experiences, and way forward. Mr. Kavu, I hope you're in the room. Please, a round of applause for Mr. Kavu, please. Sorry, we're awake. A round of applause for Mr. Kavu, please. Thank you very much. Until the movement starts, they can always move it. No, that's
okay. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I did not hear any response. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. All right, my name is Ambrose Kavu. I'll be presenting on informal sector development. And I hope my presentation will be very short. I'm not a doctor, by the way, so I hope my presentation will be very short. And going forward to, this is the presentation outline, where we'll look at the introduction, the literature review, and we'll look at a case study on manufacturing, small to medium enterprises survey report findings that was carried out in 2021. And we'll also look at the recommendations as we go on. Next slide. These are some of the activities that the informal sector is producing. As you can see, some of the products, quality and services is up to scratch, and some of it needs improvement. Next slide, please. And as we go on to introduction, we can see that the informal sector can, and as you can see, I've put in red, can contribute significantly to realization of Vision 2030. And why am I saying so? Unless that sector is transformed, then the sector will not bring much contribution to the economy of Zimbabwe. And it can play a leading role. As you know, majority of the people are actually employed in the informal sector. And for the purpose of the presentation, I will refer interchangeably SME as well as informal sector. And as we go on, we can actually see the size of the informal sector globally ranges between 65 to 75%, according to ILO, as a contribution of GDP. And when you're looking at the Zimbabwe labor force survey that was carried out in 2011, it was estimated that 5.4 million people were employed in 2011. And out of that, 4.6 million people were estimated to be in the informal sector. And I'm sure by now the figure has changed. So we need the current statistics to be able to justify our numbers. And then you can see that informal sector flourishes mostly in countries that are less developed. And as you can see in the next slide, where you see a correlation between per capita, GDP per capita, we find those countries that have got a higher GDP per capita have much less informality, and those countries with lower GDP per capita are likely to have higher informality. And generally, you can see that there's a high cost that is associated with carrying out a survey. And generally, it's probably difficult to quantify some of the activities, as you find most of the activities are done underground or basically done illegally. So basically, most people will not want to come out clearly. Next slide. Thank you. I hope I'll be able to move the slide on my own now. You basically find that these are the challenges that they face, basically, where issues of operating space, issues of structured skills, issues of unfavorable bylaws, and some of the bylaws are actually archaic, as in some of them were enacted during the colonial period. But as we stand right now, the things have changed. And you find that there is basically limited or no financing. And according to the latest report on financial inclusion, you find that only 3.9% of total banking loans was used to support the SME sector. And looks like this thing is... And generally, when you look at workers that are associated within the informal sector, you find that majority of them, they are associated with limited or lack of skills, disproportionate number of working poor people, working in unregulated sectors, high rate of illiteracy in some cases, irregular working conditions, and sometimes they work with no social security plans at all, or safety and health issues. So when you are looking at the informal sector as it stands, it's a sector that will not lead much in terms of improving or economic development within the country, as employees are physically and financially vulnerable. So that's a recipe for high poverty. So unless if the sector is transformed, then it will not change much. And then when you look at the benefits, once the sector is transformed, we can expand the tax base. We can create enduring and better paying jobs. We can improve linkages with bigger firms. We can improve framework for lobbying. We can expand access to formal markets as business services, as well as improve the working conditions. And then the role of the sector, like I said, it can remove some extreme poverty. It can create employment. And for the sector to be able to do that, there is need for transformation. And in this current state as it stands, we cannot bring much change to it. And right now, we need to be able to account for how much money is circulating. I'm sure most of us, somehow, we're actually transacting in the informal sector, and we're transacting using cash. And to be honest, how much of that transactions is being accounted for? So presently, we really need to have big statistics. These are some of the products that are being produced by our local informal sector. And this is a picture that was taken in Mashala. And for a full report, I'll focus on the case study on manufacturing SME survey that was carried out in 2021. And for more details, the full report, you can go on that website that you see on that link. So the survey was carried out across the length and breadth of Zimbabwe and across all districts. And it covered about 4,700 SMEs that were surveyed, particularly looking at those that are in manufacturing only. And the subsectors were divided into furniture and fittings, metal fabrication, construction and building materials, textile and leather, food and production, arts and crafts, paper, printing, as well as oil and chemicals industries. And these were the statistics that we derived as it pertains to the number for each subsector, where you find majority actually in the furniture and fittings, as well as metal and fabrication. I'm sure as you can all attest, in almost every location, you can find welders, you can find carpenters, and those people are producing certain things, and majority of them are operating as in the informal sector. These are some of the works that the informal sector is doing. Some of it you can see they pay attention to detail, and they also try to bring some quality in some of the products. However, as their they are operating, there are a number of issues that they also face. So the survey report sort of tried to pick the findings as it relates to performance of the manufacturing SME. And we find that generally, enterprises that are formalized have a higher revenue and profits on average compared to non-formalized. And this can be proved from the statistics that are there. I will not go much into the statistics. And then we can also see that in terms of determinants of monthly performance, female-owned enterprise produce 30.8% less sales. And you also find that enterprise whose owners have advanced level of education, qualification, and vocational training produce 34.9% and 50.3% more sales. And generally, when you are looking at small enterprise, right at the bottom, last bullet, small enterprise earn 954 more in profits, while medium enterprise earn much higher. So the smaller they are, the less likely they are in terms of generating of revenue. And then more than 70% of the SMEs, manufacturing SMEs, use non-hand tools. So I think we're stuck like in the Stone Age in terms of the production. There's lots of processes that needs to be automated, but majority of it is less than 25.3% is actually automated. And then in terms of capacity utilization, you find I had the CZI for the larger companies, manufacturing capacity utilization, if I'm not mistaken, they say something about 57%. But in this sector, you find it's around 54% as it relates to production revenue as well as the factory size capacity utilization. Okay, and then when you look at formalized enterprises, you find that they are 58.27% have higher capacity utilization compared to non-formalized enterprises. So you can see the drive for formalization. And then in terms of revenue and factory size, female-owned enterprises are likely to have a higher capacity utilization. That's a plus for women, right? Why are women having a higher capacity utilization compared to male counterparts? So it's a food for thought. Enterprise owned by entrepreneurs between 36 and 55 have a lower capacity utilization, whilst those owned by those who are young, 15 to 35 years of age, are likely to have higher capacity utilization. And then SAVE, if you look at the last bullet, SAVE for investor education. Education generally increases capacity utilization. So I'm not so sure. I think we've got professors here in this room. Is our education relevant in terms of improving the skills? I think that talk still comes in even on these findings. So we are training people in universities to be managers, but we are not skilling them in actually doing the actual production. So from this survey report, you can actually see this being revealing. And then you also find, in terms of the net worth, formalized enterprises are approximately 3 times that of non-formalized enterprise at 1% level significance. And then when you look at business net worth, we also find that female-owned enterprises have an average lower business net worth. Here, last time we talked about capacity utilization is higher, but in terms of their net worth, it's actually much lower. And the older the SMEs and the age of its owner, the higher its net worth as well. And the enterprise whose owners have university degree, have business management training, and acquired knowledge through training have a higher net worth. So which brings in the importance of training in terms of improving the sector. And we only find that only 11% of manufacturing MSMEs are registered for tax, only 11%, and we have got ZIMRA officials here in this room. And 28% are registered with local authorities, and 3% are registered with business associations. And I think we have got business associations here in this room. Why is it that most of the enterprises are not being registered into these associations? Okay, all right. So I'll try to rush through. And then when you look at value chains, we also see that the survey showed that most of the SMEs imitate each other. There's general imitation. If this one starts doing this, selling tomatoes, the next one will also do the same next door. And then in terms of access to raw materials, this is completely opposite to the larger firms, where larger firms are securing their raw materials from outside. The SMEs in general are purchasing from within, which is as a result of generally the sophistication of the processes that are involved in. And then in terms of markets is amongst themselves as well as individuals. And then in terms of infrastructure, this is one of the roads that we're trying to access. That's Gokwe North, for your information. So we could not reach Gokwe North because of the access of the road. You can see it on the right side. And then in terms of availability of water, 54% have access to water. And then 64% have got access to electricity. And these are some of the financial services that are there in the rural areas. That's in Rutenga, where you find the Mukuru services there. And that's in Gokwe, where you find the CBZ branch there. And then in terms of capital sources, 92% use their own capital, and only 2% are accessing from the financial institution. I think this is a call for the financial sector to also play a big part. And then in terms of bank account usage, only 13% have got bank accounts. And in terms of participation in the Forex RBZ, I think there was a lot of talk about access to the RBZ. From the survey that we carried out, only 1% can or are accessing money from the Forex sector, yet they are transacting more than 60% in Forex. Some of the products and safety and health. You can see when it comes to safety and health, majority of those that are handling dangerous products and are actually disposing those underground. In majority are also disposing in the sewer system, which also brings in the issues of local authorities, how our cost of treating water and so forth is so high. And then when you look at formalization, these are the findings that we find. 72% of manufacturing SMEs are not formalized. And generally, formalization is associated with older, higher education, and those that attended business management training. And you find that those that are in enterprise, in furniture and fixtures, are more likely to be informal. And those that are in paper printing, publishing sector are more likely to be formalized. And you find that formalized manufacturers are more likely to engage cross-border. And informality is associated with lower enterprise performance. And then when you go to gender, I'm almost finishing. Female-owned manufacturing SMEs have marginally higher capacity utilization, 57% versus 54% for male counterparts. And then there's a high concentration of males in the metal fabrication and fixtures, whilst females are mainly concentrated in the textiles, leather, arts, and craft sectors. This is an information center in Rutenga. So you can see, I think we've made great strides in providing internet services to the rural communities. So this is a village information center in Rutenga. And we can see some correlation in terms of only 26% have gone through formal training. And firms that use internet have got a higher business net worth as compared to those that are not using. And the management training is associated with improvements in business by those percentages, 27.6% as well as 30.1%. I'll go on quickly to the recommendation. We find that for the informal sector to be developed, we really need to play a leading role in terms of, one, formalization. We need to synchronize activities, registration processes across all sectors. I think my colleague from ZIDA talked about the issue of registration, where you are given different numbers as you move from registration with the registrar of company to the bank to ZIMRA and other registration. And then also, in terms of infrastructure and equipment, we need to play a leading role. Government needs to play a leading role in providing equipment as well as infrastructure and amenities. That includes the local authorities. And then we need to have value chain linkages between the large and small players. And we need to have skills training on complex productions as well as safety, health, and quality issues. And we also need to have the financial sector having innovative products that capture that sector. Above all, we also need to carry out more regular more regular, like I said, more regular surveys so that we can be able to quantify and be able to produce latest and relevant figures as it relates to the activities of the sector. And lastly, we also need to avoid a silo approach to the sector. I'm told with Zimran, they now have got a section that is fully dedicated for the SME sector development. And the challenge is not to work in isolation. We need to have the academia, government, financial institutions, non-governmental organizations, research institutions working together in that task force so that we can all play a part in the sector of the development. And I'll conclude. While the informal sector is important in employment creation and elimination of extreme poverty, it does not eliminate poverty in totality due to the nature and the characteristics of the sector. The sector can make great strides towards economic development and in poverty alleviation only if transformed. Thank you very much.
Yes, please. Yeah. A round of applause, please, for Mr. Kavu from Zedcon. Excuse me. Very, very interesting statistics there looking at the informal sector. I'm hoping that there will be time later to be able to ask questions. If not, there's another session that we will have later on in the day. We still have 2 sessions, in fact, before our opening or during the course of the day, and we'll be able to ask the various presenters questions at that time. It now gives me great pleasure to welcome and invite up to the podium Mrs. Marjorie Mpundu. She is the country manager of the World Bank. She'll be talking to the subject, boosting productivity of the informal sector. So please give a round of applause for Mrs. Mpundu.
Good morning, everybody, and let me just say all protocols observed. I would like to thank the Ministry of Finance for inviting us to this event. And after yesterday's, some of yesterday's interventions, I hope we still welcome Ashok here as the World Bank. My presentation will focus on a recent analysis that the World Bank has done on productivity of the informal sector. This analysis is part of the broader analysis that we do in all countries that we work. We call it the Country Economic Memorandum. We hope to share, so we're still working on it. It will be finalized in the next couple of months, and we'll share publicly the full findings of the report. So for now, I'll just share the preliminary, what we are seeing at this stage. So let me focus on the topic of informality. We look at it from a productivity lens, as we believe that achieving the government's vision 2030 of becoming an upper middle income country will be possible only with significant improvements in productivity levels. My presentation will focus on the link between productivity and informality. I'll look at the characteristics of informality. Then I'll turn to the drivers of informality, and I'll present some recommendations on how we can tackle informality. Why do we say Zimbabwe faces a significant productivity challenge? When you look at what is required to reach a upper middle income status, we will need to basically double the productivity rate to about 8 to 9% per year over the next decade. This is a significant challenge that requires some drastic changes in the policy environment. So let's look at the skill set. When you look at Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe has a very educated, skilled labor force compared to its peers. The orange lines on the first slide shows you where Zimbabwe is compared to its peers in sub-Saharan Africa. We are doing well on the labor force and on the digital skills. We are lacking, we lag behind a little bit on the future labor force. But notwithstanding the well-educated and skilled labor force, if you look on the other slide, we are still struggling on productivity. The productivity levels for Zimbabwe are much lower than those of its peers. And let me just qualify that the peaks you see on sub-Saharan Africa are influenced mainly because of Nigeria and South Africa. And that's why we compared also to low middle income countries globally. In the manufacturing, so we can go to the next slide. Yeah, can we go to the next slide? In the manufacturing sector, there's significant dispensation of total productivity levels, which suggests a significant misallocation of resources. This means that the most productive firms are very few and have larger productivity levels than the rest of the firms. This signals that there might be economic distortions that favor less productive firms, and such distortions could arise from credit market distortions and even implementation of regulations and preferential tax treatment. It could also mean that entry into the formal sector has become less attractive, as firms in Zimbabwe are almost twice as old as in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. And I think the previous presenter also indicated this. Indeed, Zimbabwe has taken some steps to ease the entry of new firms in recent years, but the regulatory framework for startups remains burdensome. How does informality affect productivity? From two angles. First, informal firms are less productive than formal firms. And the productivity gap between the formal and informal firms at similar size is about 90%. Second, competition from informal firms is putting down the productivity of formal firms. So what we are seeing is in sectors where you have a lot of informality, the productivity levels for formal firms is affected, it drops. Where there's less informality, those formal firms are thriving. So this is another thing that is coming up. If you look at cross-country analysis, it shows that such competition can reduce the productivity of formal firms by 24%. Let me turn now to some basic characteristics of the informal sector. Zimbabwe has one of the largest informal sectors in the world. We look at two measures of informality, the output and employment informality. The informal sector accounts for about 62% of output and 80% of employment, notably above the level of informality in countries with similar GDP per capita levels. Relatively higher output informality has persisted in Zimbabwe, over the past 3 decades, and it ages up during episodes of economic downturns. Informality is spread across all sectors, but as you can see from this slide, it is concentrated a lot on the wholesale and retail trade side. We can move to the next one. Yeah. And informality is associated with a range of development challenges. Countries with informality tend to have much higher poverty and inequality levels than countries with lower informality. High informality is associated also with lower government revenues and consequently lower public spending, which limits the provision of key public services. So this, you can see the correlation on the other side of informality and fiscal outcomes. But what are the drivers of informality? We identify 2 big groups of drivers. One is the macroeconomic challenge, and the second is the business climate and regulations. Inflation and exchange rate distortions, limited urbanization, and insufficient job opportunities in the formal sector have contributed to pervasive informality in Zimbabwe. In contrast to other countries, Zimbabwe was not able to reverse the increase of informality in the post-recession periods. Both output and employment informality remained high during the economic growth period of 2009 to 2018. The second part is the business regulation. Yeah. So business regulations are another important driver of informality. Our enterprise survey, the World Bank Enterprise Survey, showed that informal firms in Zimbabwe were not registered due to time, fees, paperwork involved, high tax burdens, and costly government inspections. More than half of the informal prefer to stay that way due to perceived limited benefits associated with registration here. And being formal will not lead to better access to finance. They also indicated that it will not lead to fewer bribes or better linkages with formal sector. So what can we do? What can be done to address the high informality in Zimbabwe? And I will be concluded soon, Andy. The global experience shows that a policy package is required to tackle this issue. And such policy package needs to be comprehensive and focused on long-term development. A comprehensive policy package would include policies that ensure price stability, reduce misallocation of resources, and support vulnerable groups, especially during transitions. It is obvious that informality cannot be tackled in one go, and that efforts will need to be taken over a longer-term horizon. Therefore, it will be important to have a long-term strategy that aims at boosting private sector productivity by advancing institutional reforms, streamlining regulations, developing the financial sector, and investing in human capital. So we propose 2 pathways to tackle informality in support of boosting productivity and quality of jobs. The first pathway focuses on policies to boost productivity of the informal sector. What we have seen globally and from regional experience shows that providing seed funding to small-scale, largely informal firms, accompanied by training or support for the development of business plans, has a positive impact on their productivity. Other policies that have proven to be effective are improvements in access to information, access to markets, and government services for firms and entrepreneurs. Sector and gender-specific policies can also be effective and can help improve the working and living conditions of vulnerable people across the informal sector. The second pathway is what do we do in the long term? So looking at the longer term horizon. And this will involve policies that will take a while to bear fruit. First and foremost, it will be critical to ensure the macroeconomic environment is conducive for growth of formal firms. Second, there's need for a notable improvement in the business climate, including reduction in the startup costs. Third, lowering the tax burden and compliance costs will increase the attractiveness of being formal. And finally, the digitalization of government services has proven to reduce the cost of being formal and increase the transparency of government operations. In conclusion, let me reiterate that the high productivity levels needed to reach the upper middle income status can only be achieved if the productivity of the informal sector also increases sufficiently over the following decade, and if there are incentives to shift from informality to the formal sector. Thank you so much.
Please, another round of applause for the World Bank Country Manager, Mrs. Mbundu. That was such a critical presentation, and thank you so much for it. And just a quick recap, you know, again, interesting and informal sector, talking about price and exchange rate stability. That's very key throughout the entire economy. Banking the unbanked, access to finance for the informal sector, information, simplifying the regulations, tax burden. The one interesting one is sector and gender-specific divide. If you recall, the census came out proving that there was, as usual, more women than men in Zimbabwe. And I think ZTN's headline was Zimbabwe running out of men. So, so that was very interesting. But anyway, I think that gender-specific is important because we seem to forget that there are more women than men. Unfortunately, I'm not going to ask the organizers the ratio of men to women in this room, but I also get the feeling that there's more men than women in this room. But anyway, I'll leave that to another day. Right, now then, without further ado, because obviously we have to be strict on time, we are now going to be joined by Dr. Prosper Chitambara. He's the founding director of Ledgers. He'll be joining us virtually, and he'll be talking to pro-poor, inclusive, and sustainable industrialization within SADC. So again, our theme is informal sector development and poverty reduction for the day. This is a very, very important segment. So let me turn over to Prosper. Prosper, good morning and welcome to Zedcon 2022. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me as well?
Yes, we can hear you. All right, Prosper, if you share your screen nicely and then you can proceed, please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to be very brief. Let me maybe start by extending warm greetings to you all and say all protocols observed. I'll just give you a macro perspective in terms of where we are with respect to manufacturing in the region, and also some challenges that manufacturing SMEs are actually facing, because I believe that's critical in order to guide the right mix of structural and targeted policies in order to enhance their contribution to sustainable development within the SADC region. But I should also say that I think a lot of what I was going to say has already been mentioned by the previous speakers. So when you look at the contribution of SMEs in general, it accounts for between 40 and 60% of GDP in developed and developing economies. and it generates about 40% of global industrial production and 35% of world exports. Of course, these numbers are significantly higher when you include informal SMEs. So a lot of our SMEs, especially within the manufacturing sector, are actually operating informally. So SMEs, in particular in manufacturing, are critical. Why? Because about 7 out of 10 new jobs that are actually being created in emerging and developing economies are actually created by SMEs. And when you consider the fact that we are projecting a significant growth in the working age population of almost 300% in Africa in general by 2035, it actually means that supporting the manufacturing SMEs especially will be very, very critical in terms of absorbing this huge army of the working age population that's going to be unleashed by 2035. Of course, there are a number of challenges that face SMEs, especially those that are in the manufacturing sector. The doing business environment is very skewed and very challenging. The high cost of doing business, the tax administration, the tax structure, the onerous tax burden, and of course, access to utilities, access to electricity. But I may probably highlight the fact that the biggest challenge, macroeconomic and development challenge facing our economies in SADC is the fact that we have a huge competitiveness gap, we have a huge productivity gap. In other words, we have a low capacity to produce and to export manufactured goods. So we are not producing enough. And in most cases, even the little that we are actually producing, we are producing at a very, very high cost. So we need to address that huge competitiveness gap that's actually there. We also note that if we are to unlock potential within the region, then there is need for sustained investments within the SME sector. A strong SME sector is critical in terms of fostering employment, in terms of value addition, as well as in terms of supporting industrialization within the SADC region. And of course, the empirical evidence is actually supported the hypothesis that the manufacturing sector remains key or the engine for promoting inclusive and employment-intensive growth. So manufacturing is critical if we are to move up the value chain, and also if we are to ensure structural transformation and economic diversification. So manufacturing SMEs, they hold the key in terms of ensuring that there is sustainable, proper and inclusive industrialization within the SADC region. When we look at how our economies within the sub-region or the region are performing in terms of our growth performance, yes, there has been growth, there has been improvement, especially the last year. But I think the major story there is that our economies are not producing adequate employment opportunities to absorb the huge working age population, especially the youth. So our growth has not been inclusive. Our growth has not been employment intensive across the different countries within the SADC region. That table there shows the performance in terms of GDP per capita. Of course, there are a lot of challenges in that respect. When you look at the performance in general for 2020, it's negative. So that really doesn't augur well. So when you look at population growth, say, for example, in SADC, we have averaged about 2.7% over the past 10 years. And it actually means that we need to be growing at least by 7%, which is part of the target within the SADC industrialization strategy and action plan. But of course, most countries, all countries, in fact, their growth has been less than 7%, as shown in table 2. So, in terms of manufacturing value added as a percentage of GDP, you can see the trends from 1990 across the different countries, and you can also see the averages. So the SADC average for 2020 was 12.1%, which was slightly higher than the sub-Saharan Africa average of 11.2%, but below the world average of about 15.9%. So that's the picture in terms of manufacturing value added. But the story is that for most economies, they've actually been deindustrializing our industrial capacity. Our competitive industrial performance and capacity has actually been weakening over time. In terms of the structure of value added across those three sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, services, you can see how the different countries within the SADC region have performed between 2010 and 2030. And also in terms of sectoral employment as a percentage of total employment, I think the story there is that agriculture still dominates in terms of contribution to total employment across most countries within the SADC region. Then the chart there shows the exports from SADC compared to exports from China and other developing economies by region in 2019. So those numbers were actually calculated using data from UNCTAD stats. You can actually see that for SADC, excluding South Africa, our manufactured exports are only 5% of total exports. Then 35% are ores and metals, 51% are fuels, and about 9% agricultural products. Then for South Africa, you can see South Africa about 40% of their total exports are manufactured exports. Then only 32% are ores and metals, 14% are fuels, and another 14% agricultural products. But you can compare with China. China is a very strong industrial base. China is the second most competitive economy after Germany, according to the UNIDO statistics. Their manufactured exports account for as much as 91%, is actually shown in that chart there. Then in terms of the World Bank Logistics Performance Index in SADC, as of 2018, you can see how economies have been performing. So the minimum threshold that is actually required for an economy to be able to trade effectively and efficiently is about 3. But most countries in the SADC region are performing below the threshold of 3. Is shown there. Then, in terms of distribution of competitiveness, industrial performance scores by quintiles as of 2018. So this from UNIDO stats. We can actually see that, with the exception of South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, most all the economies within the SADC, within the Southern Africa region, are actually within the bottom quintile. I'm just going to skip this in the interest of time. Then when you look at the biggest binding constraint, especially affecting manufacturing SMEs in the region, is the poor or inadequate access to credit. In discussions that we had with, or discussions that we're actually having with manufacturing SMEs, they've actually highlighted that it's difficult for them to be able to access credit. And of course, what makes it worse is the fact that most of the manufacturing SMEs are actually operating informally. So that's a big challenge. And even in countries where they've created institutions to provide support to SMEs, again, that support is inadequate. And there is need, obviously, for better also even private sector and even development financing to bridge the huge financing gap that is actually there. So an estimate has been done to calculate the financing gap in terms of SMEs across the world. They actually they came up with a figure of almost 3 trillion. So in terms of the financing gap for SMEs in general, it's about around $3 trillion US. Then, of course, there's also most SMEs feel that banks are best to them because of a lack of credit history, poor financial records, and also a lack of credible business plans. And then when you look at financial inclusion in the region, again, it's on the low side, and obviously that affects access to finance by SMEs. Then the trade and business infrastructure to support SME, especially to be able to be part of international trade and global and value chains, I think also remains very, very weak. And in particular, access to electricity across the sub-region, it's a major challenge.
Prosper, and, 5 minute countdown, Prosper, thank you.
Ensuring that SMEs are actually able to function more effectively and efficiently. And another challenge in terms of enhancing participation of SMEs within the global value chains is the fact that there's a huge information asymmetry in terms of awareness and understanding of the structure and dynamics of the global value chains by SMEs. And obviously that hampers their participation. Most SMEs are not actually able to define and to identify their competitive strengths and advantages within the regional and even the global value chains. So they are not able to optimize their participation therein. Then issues of compliance with strict product quality standards, it's also an issue that comes up, that's been coming up in terms of our discussions with SMEs. And also the preponderance, the prevalence rather of non-tariff barriers by most countries. Then obviously poor access to technology and also weak institutional support in general. Then in terms of, let me just go to how can we ensure greater integration of SMEs within the global value chains. I think what's needed is to focus on 6 areas. The first one being the business environment, which has been challenging. We need to improve the doing business in general. We also need to focus on entrepreneurship. We need to focus on access to finance. We need to be focusing on business development services, innovation and technology, as well as market access to international trade and to regional and global value chains. Then the integration of these SMEs into these global value chains is also critical for ensuring structural transformation and finance for developing countries, including SADC countries. But of course, it won't happen automatically. So there's need for a value chain participation plan for SMEs. That must be part of the national strategies within the SADC economies. Then, of course, the issue of adequate infrastructure is very, very critical. So we need to be investing in adequate infrastructure to support participation by SMEs within regional and global value chains. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area also provides an opportunity to support transformation and to enhance the capacity of also SMEs, especially in terms of promoting linkages across the subcontinent and even across the sub-region. Then digitalization is also very critical in order to leverage participation within the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and also boost manufacturing while creating productive jobs. So there's a huge digital divide, especially between the large firms and the smaller firms. So enhancing in digital infrastructure, ICT, reducing the cost of internet, offering incentives for the private sector to invest in those areas will be critical in terms of ensuring that SMEs are able to actually transition or part of the digital transformation that's taking place globally. Then there's also need for formulation of a regional SMEC policy and charter to ensure that the support and the initiatives that are geared towards the sector are coordinated in a better way, and also address the regulatory burden that's disproportionately heavy on small businesses. Then the creation of an SMEs business portal where SMEs can showcase their products and services is also very, very critical. And of course, the development of a regional credit rating and credit information reference and referral systems for SMEs. I think this is critical in terms of ensuring that SMEs are able to access credit, especially from the private sector and development finance institutions. Then we need to improve our data coverage. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have in terms of coming up with the right kind of policies to support SMEs. There's a gap in terms of timely and disaggregated data, especially at sectoral level, and this then affects the policies that are then implemented, the effectiveness rather of the policies that are then implemented to deal with some of the challenges affecting the SMEs in general. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Please, another round of applause. Prosper Chitambara from Ledris. Thank you very much, Prosper. You know, it's interesting in the context of what Zimbabwe or what we think about the informal sector and SMEs in particular. SMEs are the industrial driver in most countries everywhere around the world, UK, US, and so forth. And you can see that both the World Bank presentation by Marjorie and also Prosper, and even to a degree, Mr. Kavu, really has shown that even though in the NDS1, there are clear strategies to bring the formal sector in to boost SME growth and make SMEs more mainstream economically. There's no doubt if you've read the NDS1, but there's obviously some policy recommendations there that we can look at again in terms of seeing if we can bolster the NDS1 document and try and see if we can bring them in. I mean, just a few things. Trade policies, I think we spoke about that on day 2. How can we integrate SMEs and possibly the informal sector into trade policies? How do we stimulate market access within the SADC region and try and do that through both the trade policies? And again, we're back down to price, exchange rate stabilization, market access, and so on. So it's nice to see that both papers really came up with similar recommendations, similar ideas. And I think the idea now is to see if it's possible to integrate some of those recommendations into the existing NDS1 policies and then obviously through the budget 2023. Right, now then, if I may, if I could ask, while I'm bringing up the panelists, if I could ask you to bring some chairs here behind the podium, please, for the next panel discussion. All right, our next panel discussion, and thank goodness, thank you so much, we are on time. Now I'm going to ask the moderator to please keep this discussion, and it will end just at around 10 o'clock. I say that because I would like at least 15 minutes for us to have a discussion on what we've spoken about today. I think it's important for the delegates in the room to talk about the informal sector, give us some more ideas, more views, more comments. So I'd like 15 minutes at the end of this moderation session to open it up to questions, comments for both the panelists and any of the speakers that have spoken today. They are available to take your questions. Now then, I'd like to call up to the podium, please, the panelists. First of all, I'd like to call up Dr. G. Kanyenze he's the CEO of Ledris. Mr. Kanyenze, please step forward. Mr. J. Shumbambini, if I pronounce that right, from Zimra. I apologize for my tongue. Zimra, please, will you please come up? And Dr. O. Odiambo, Senior Advisor, UNDP. I hope you're available. Please come up. And of course, I would like to call on the moderator who will be moderating this entire session, Mr. Mishek Ugaro. He's the Vice President of the Zimbabwe Economic Society. Thank you. So please, a round of applause for our panelists and the moderator. Yeah, let's sit in the, yeah, I am scary sometimes. Right, sit there, thanks. Right, Mishek, you'll stand, right? Zimra, okay, there's your last panel. Sorry, my brother, so you have until 10. You want 10 o'clock. Yeah, 10 o'clock.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to say all protocol observed. Before I ask my panelists to speak, I just wanted to reiterate the message from my president yesterday to welcome you all to the Zimbabwe Economic Society, because we are going to have a lot of interactions to follow through on the discussions we are having today. We want to be the monitoring agent of whatever we would have agreed here. So please come through and become members. So we are on, we've got, and welcome to our panelists. Before I ask them to speak, or maybe I can ask them to speak, then I have a few questions. I will start with Mr. Odiambo on my immediate right to try and understand the World Bank view and it's the UNDP view on informalization, and perhaps if we can learn a few things from the experiences of the other countries that have gone through formalizing the informal sector.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'd just like to make three points at this point in time. Having listened to the three presentations and looking at some of the stylized facts that have been presented, especially in terms of contribution to output and contribution to jobs, that when you talk about the informal economy in Zimbabwe, that is the economy. That is the economy. So all our discussions as we continue forward should be really focused on how we can then transform that as the basis of development. From UNDP perspective, our concern is really how the relationship that exists between the informal economy and poverty. And whereas we don't have enough observations for any meaningful economic analysis, we have observed that whenever the contribution of informal economy, either to jobs or to output increases, the levels of poverty also increase. So there is a direct correlation between the level of informality and the level of poverty. Since we don't have any analysis done, we can say that yes, these two phenomena are actually conjoined. So you cannot address poverty without addressing informality. You cannot therefore achieve SDGs without addressing informality. And this brings me to what we have been doing in support of government efforts to transition from a largely informal economy to a formal economy. What we have been doing over the past, I think 1 year, Godfrey, is to support initiatives aimed at coming up with a national strategy for a formalization strategy, and I'm sure Godfrey will speak to it. But suffice to say that as the UN family, we have been supporting government, UNDP, ILO, and by extension, the entire UN family in Zimbabwe, and supporting government to come up with a formalization strategy. This is not just a strategy that outlines what to be done, what needs to be done, but it also looks at how it will be done, how it will be monitored, and who is responsible for what. So we, as the UN family, are happy to be associated with this process because we believe, I think 2 months ago, we were here, Godfrey, if you recall, and we realized that Zimbabwe is trailblazing in terms of this formalized process of moving towards a more formal economy as opposed to more informal economy. I would like to stop here at this point in time, and we can take questions later. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Odiambo. We'll move on to Dr. Kanyenze. I'm aware, Doc, that you have a presentation, a detailed presentation coming on later. So I'll limit your comments. At the moment, Maybe following through to Mr. Odhiambo's presentation on the need to formalize and come up with a formalization strategy, maybe in a bit to just address that aspect. What is it that we should be doing? We saw the presentations here and all the recommendations. So how do we do that? Maybe in very brief.
Thank you so very much, moderator. I think what is important is to give a bit of background in terms of how this whole concept evolved. And I think it does clarify quite a number of the issues that you are raising. Firstly, the concept evolved from an ILO study mission of Kenya in 1972 to discuss or to study activities that were actually outside the mainstream economy. And one of my supervisors, Hans Singer at Sussex IDS, was actually the team leader. And the thinking then was that this phenomenon was a transient phenomenon. It would just disappear with the development. I think that was the thinking then in 1972. But by the 1990s, it was very clear that the phenomenon had not only disappeared, but it had actually entrenched itself. And then there was a discussion what was actually happening. And part of what emerged during the discussions was that it was actually an anomaly to call it an informal sector. Even though we still call it informal sector, the idea was that it is a diverse sector, variegated sector, characterized by a diverse range of activities, to the extent that it may not constitute what one may actually call a sector. And hence, they shifted to the concept of informal economy. The idea also was to go beyond just an enterprise-based definition, which looked at the characteristics of an enterprise. If an enterprise is not registered, etc., falls outside formal arrangement, then it is informal. Then that was the idea of a sector. But then they also identified that the phenomenon was also being identified even within the formal sector itself. Especially now with globalization, you still get that. So that they came up now with a second attribute, the job-based definition, which basically looks at the attributes, characteristics of that particular job. So a job may not be properly covered, irregular, etc., when it is either in the informal sector or in the in the formal sector, or also in the household sector, like domestic employment. So that's the broader concept, which informs this whole idea of an informal economy. What is also very critical when you are discussing informality in the context of countries like Zimbabwe, you cannot divorce it from the history, the colonial history. The colonial economy was developed on the basis of a dual sort of economy. The majority of the blacks were left in the rural areas, poor soil, poor rainfall, etc., with low levels of productivity, etc., using very basic implements. You find a lot of labor. There's a lot of labor bodies working with very basic implements. If you look at the modes of production, very low productivity, as the World Bank is showing us, very little implements, very basic implements, probably a hoe. There's a lot of exertion, no working hours, irregularity of the working hours, etc. You work so hard to achieve very little. I think that's what we see also. So the idea at independence was that this was an opportunity now to expand the formal segment. But unfortunately, as we saw yesterday, what has actually happened is the opposite. We have experienced deindustrialization to the extent that even the small formal segment that we had, the so-called good jobs, if you look at the geo-economic model, the good jobs are in the formal, the bad jobs in the non-formal, including the informal economy. So what has happened over time is that we've seen a rapid expansion of that which we wanted to formalize at independence. So to the extent that, according to the statistics, it's good that Zimstat has actually now been producing statistics since 2004, where the level of informality was 80%, and then it went up to 84% in the 2011 labor force